I am delighted to be here for the second time. It was the end of June, 6 months ago, that I spoke on Light History of English, and I enjoy that. But to be honest, my field is Charles Dickens. So there's no topic that I speak on that I enjoy more than Dickens. So I can say, if you don't like me today on Dickens, you'd hate me on anything else. But I do think you are going to enjoy it. And I must say, given that Christmas is less than 2 weeks away, and I am speaking on Charles Dickens, and whether you know it or not, most critics call his work, A Christmas Carol, quote, the greatest expression of the Christmas spirit in the English language, unquote. So given that there are less than 2 weeks to go before Christmas, I want to begin by talking not just about A Christmas Carol. I'm really not talking about it as much as how Dickens changed the celebration of Christmas as we know it today, simply by writing A Christmas Carol in 1843. It is a fact that that one work became so beloved and so famous that we actually have changed how we celebrate Christmas because he wrote it. I need to prove that. It's not difficult, and I'm going to start right now. Now, let me say from the beginning, when it came out in 1843, people were so impressed with the supernatural elements of this tale. You all know the tale. You all know there's Marley's ghost, the ghost of Christmas past, present, and future. Well, today it's no big deal to have supernatural creatures in everything. But back then, 1843, people just thought Dickens's imagination was unending to come up with these ghosts in this work. I mention that because as great as Dickens's imagination was back then, I am convinced that even he could not possibly imagine what I am doing and you are doing right now. I am in my dining room in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm speaking to a number, maybe 67 of you, so far away, a day's drive north up 95 and then 87, and yet you're looking at me as if I were standing right in front of you, although I can't hear you. The idea of my not having to leave my dining room to talk about Charles Dickens is incredible. And if he could imagine that, I bet he couldn't imagine that there I am sitting, you're looking at me. I've got on my suit jacket, I have on a nice shirt, but only thanks to the miracle of Zoom, and this is probably too much information for you, if the camera would zoom down, which it won't, you would discover that I'm giving a talk on Dickens in December, wearing kind of a pair of ratty shorts of mine, no socks, no shoes. Now that is magic, but that's not what you're here to hear about. You're here to hear about Dickens. So let me begin by convincing you that Dickens did change the celebration of Christmas. In some ways, I feel guilty about talking about Dickens with anything connected with Christmas Carol. As you know, it is the one thing that makes him immortal. You can go about your business for 11 months out of the year, never having to think about Charles Dickens once, and then suddenly, come December, you can't escape him. If your playhouse in town is doing a play in December, it's gonna be Christmas Carol for sure. You can see caricatures of Ebenezer Scrooge in December wearing headphones or knee pads or whatever else, and it says, don't be a Scrooge, buy this product. I mean, we are Christmas caroled to death in December, and then in January, Dickens disappears. Don't have to think about him at all. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Good heavens, you're connected with the library. You're thinking, but that's not true. Yes, he's known for Christmas Carol, but didn't Dickens also write Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, Tale of Two Cities? He wrote all three of those. And he's been dead now for almost 150 years. And whether people have read them or not, everybody knows Great Expectations, Oliver Twist, Tale of Two Cities. So along with Christmas Carol, that's 4 works that long after he's dead, people associate with him. Now that would be impressive, but it's not. If Dickens knew that in 2021, he was known for those few works, he would be sick. And that is because when Dickens was alive, He wrote 16 major works, and everybody in America and England read all 16 and knew them thoroughly. But today, more than a century later, he's known for just the few I mentioned. What has happened to Dickens? It's really sad. He did write 16 major works, but unfortunately for him, all but 4 of them are 700 pages long or longer. You will be shocked to hear the names of the 4 works that Dickens wrote that are less than 700 pages. They are Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, Tale of Two Cities, and A Christmas Carol. Today, we do not read the best or worst of Charles Dickens. We read the least of Charles Dickens. We pick up his novels. If they weigh 700 pages, out they go. Who has time? And of the 4 lesser works in terms of pages, you know which one is shortest by far. Christmas Carol. Now, as I said at the beginning, it is a brilliant work. He should be very happy people read it. But what I want to do right now is to show you how the celebration of Christmas is very different because he wrote it. Point number 1. Christmas Carol, I told you, came out in December of 1843. It turns out 5 days after it came out, a man named Sir Henry Cole wrote and commissioned the first Christmas card in history. He had it commissioned, he invented the Christmas card, and then he sent it to all of his friends in London and all over England. Now, we know for a fact that he had read Dickens's Christmas Carol on the first day it appeared 5 days earlier. So we know that reading A Christmas Carol inspired him to write the first Christmas card, and we have been, let's face it, suffering from that ever since. You know, it would be remarkable enough that Dickens inspired the first Christmas card with the writing of Christmas Carol, but it's way more impressive than that. Listen to this. That first Christmas card in December of 1843 is the first greeting card ever sent. So not only did Dickens's work inspire the Christmas card, it inspired the entire greeting card industry. I don't have to tell you at the beginning of the 21st century how vast and broad the greeting card industry is that Dickens inspired. You know, there happens to be in Manhattan, which I assume is just about 2 hours south of you, there is a shop in New York City that claims it has the largest inventory of greeting cards in the world, and I believe it. I was up there many years ago and I walked through this incredible greeting card shop, and I swear to you, I saw a greeting card in the back that said on its front, it said, "To my secretary's father on his retirement." Now, you know, if we've got greeting cards today that actually congratulate a secretary's father on retirement, we are talking about a huge industry. Actually, my favorite card that I saw in this shop, and I swear there was one, it said, "Congratulations on adopting a highway." They have cards that congratulate you for going out on Saturday morning and sweeping off trash on certain roads near you. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it really does all go back to that first Christmas card that is the first greeting card that was inspired because Dickens wrote such a brilliant Christmas story that Sir Henry Cole started the whole thing. Many critics call A Christmas Carol the high mark of Dickens's writing career. I call it the hallmark, and now you know why. All right, so he inspired the first Christmas card, but we can't really credit Dickens with that. He just inspired it. But the next thing we do is all his. Believe it or not, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens in 1843 is the first example in literature where Christmas and snow come together. Yes, I am telling you that Dickens wrote the first white Christmas. Now, am I saying there had never been snow mentioned in a story that took place at Christmas? Of course there had been. 'Twas the night before Christmas came out 15 years before Dickens's Christmas Carol in 1828, and it does mention snow connected with Christmas, but that's not what I'm talking about. It's not just that Dickens has a white Christmas, it's how he impregnates Christmas with snow in such a remarkable way that has changed how we think about Christmas. And I'm not talking about the snow on Christmas, it's far more important than that. Before I tell you what he did, what atmosphere he gave to Christmas because of this, first let me say, of all the writers on earth who would give us the first white Christmas in literature, it shouldn't have been Charles Dickens. And that is because, as you know, Charles Dickens is from England. And we have meteorological records going way back to the 18th century in England. So I can tell you for a fact how often it snows in London, where Dickens was from, on Christmas. Get ready to be shocked. On average, it snows on Christmas or Christmas Eve in the London environments and to the south where Dickens lives, it snows once every 52 years. It just doesn't snow on Christmas. They have snow sometime in London, but you remember, of course, England is an island. It has those warm currents. The average temperature at Christmas, the low, 35 degrees. Oh, it's wretched sometimes on Christmas. It's mizzly and drizzly and rainy, but it doesn't snow except once every 52 years. And it turns out Dickens died when he was 58. So technically, this man should have seen only one white Christmas in his life. So doesn't it strike you as odd that a man who came from a place where the weather's wretched but not snowy on Christmas is the first to connect Christmas and snow in a very important way? Well, it should be shocking until you learn this. It turns out, of course, when Dickens was born, which was 1812, it didn't snow on Christmas that year. When he was 1 in 1813, no snow on Christmas. 1814, he's 2, no white Christmas. 1815, he's 3, no white Christmas. But then, between his 3rd and 4th birthday, the largest recorded explosion on Earth occurred in the South Seas. Now, if you know much about volcanoes, you might think, Krakatoa. No, Krakatoa came way later and was not nearly as big, but we know Krakatoa because by the time it came around, there was telegraph, everybody heard about it. But in 1816, Mount Tambora exploded, and it was so huge that the dark black ash that was sent into the atmosphere was so thick and remained there so long that the average temperature on Earth would drop between 4 and 5 degrees. I know you see where I'm going with this. So in 1816, after that explosion, it was so cold that on Dickens's 4th year alive, his 4th Christmas, you bet it snowed because it wasn't 34 anymore. It was about 29. So he had snow on Christmas when he was 4. And the results of Mount Tambora and what it did to cause winter didn't just last that first year. The temperature on Earth took a while to recover. And so when Dickens was 5, it snowed again. When he was 6, he had a white Christmas. He didn't have one when he was 7, but he had another one when he was 8. And then by then, after his 8th birthday and 8th Christmas, all the effects of Tambora disappeared. And so the next time Dickens would have had a white Christmas, he had been dead 6 years. So what I want to emphasize to you is by sheer luck, we have this great writer, Charles Dickens, a sensitive little boy who, when he sat down to write A Christmas Carol, he did what we all do. He thinks about his childhood Christmases. And he's from the only generation of Englishmen ever to live who experienced a white Christmas in his most impressionable years when he was 4, 5, 6, and 8. So when he picked up that quill to write his immortal Christmas carol, of course he gives us a white Christmas, because that's what he was used to. That's why the white Christmas is in Dickens, because of that atmospheric phenomenon. That is why it is in it. But I don't want to just tell you that Dickens had a white Christmas. I wouldn't have wasted your time. It's what he did with making Christmas white. He gave an atmosphere to Christmas that had never been in it before. That once I tell you what it is, you will say, you're right, I can't think of Christmas anymore without it. Believe it or not, A Christmas Carol gives us the first cozy Christmas in literature. And I defy you to tell me that we don't think of Christmas as cozy ever since. I don't care if you're living in Australia or New Zealand, where it's one of the hottest days of the year. Dickens's Christmas Carol was so big and so influential that the whole earth, when they think of Christmas, think of cozy. Now, you need to understand how important this concept is. I assume most of you, if I asked you, what does it mean to be cozy? You would know, or you'd think you'd know. You'd say, well, I mean, to be cozy is to be comfortable. And you would be wrong. Notice I tell you what you're going to say. You say it wrong, and then I say, no, you idiot, that's not it at all. No, cozy does not mean comfortable, and I can prove it. I hope all of you this afternoon in your home or wherever you're watching me, I'm pretty sure you're comfortable, but not one of you is cozy. But you know, all it would take would be about 15 seconds from now for you to get really cozy. You know the only way you could be cozy now? Let's say someone right now pounds on your door. You open it and they say, you're not going to believe it. In the past half hour, the temperature around Poughkeepsie has dropped 60 degrees. There's a 50-mile-an-hour wind. Look at that. I mean, the wind chill is off the charts. People are being blown over on the streets. Dogs are sticking to fire hydrants throughout the city. It's god-awful wretched. And of course, you, being the decent person you are, hearing this and closing the door, inviting the person in, but you don't want to let in all that, you'd be thinking, this is terrible. I feel so awful for those wretched people outside in the bitter cold and wind who could freeze to death. But of course, because you are a human being, after that first thought of, isn't that awful for them, your second thought's going to be, but you know what? I'm in my house. It's nice and warm. I'm feeling good. And you know what? In comparison to those suckers outside who are suffering, I feel cozy. You see, the wonderful thing about cozy is it does mean comfortable, but it means being comfortable in the knowledge that 15 feet out from where you are, it is wretched, it is awful, there is terrible suffering, but you're not there. You're in here. So in comparison, it's cozy. Cozy depends on discomfort somewhere for you to be comfortable. Now, having said that, and I hope you wouldn't disagree with me, it's nice we have the microphones off, so even if you want to, you can't. But let's just assume you agree, yes, that is what cozy means. Well, how did Dickens put that odd sensation into Christmas? And we've never gotten rid of it. I'll tell you how he did it. I want you to remember A Christmas Carol, and that's not hard. We've all seen productions. We've all read it, perhaps. You may remember that the ghosts teach Scrooge how to be a decent person by simply having him follow them through the streets of London. You know, the ghost of Christmas past, present, yet to come. Scrooge is always asleep. It's midnight, 1 a.m. In his bedroom, he's wearing that thin nightshirt, but the ghosts ask him to touch their garment, and then suddenly the walls of Scrooge's place disappear, and he and whatever ghost it is are kind of flying throughout London for his lesson, and they're hovering in that cold, cold air. I want you to think of the Cratchit Christmas. We all know the Cratchit Christmas, and Mrs. Cratchit brings it in, but what you might forget is where you are when you witness that Cratchit Christmas. I'll tell you where you are. Dickens made sure that our point of view as readers is the exact same one as Scrooge and the ghost. You may not remember this, but they are hovering outside the dining room window of the Cratchits. I mean, Scrooge has an icicle on his nose. It's wretched. He's in that, in that nightshirt, and they're looking in at the Cratchit Christmas dinner. And I don't think I need to remind you that the Cratchits don't have much money. There's not a whole lot of food on the table. And to be honest, they're not dressed very well, and it's really not much of a Christmas. But you see, our point of view is outside in the cold. When we look in at the Cratchit Christmas, you know how it seems? You guessed it. It's terribly cozy, because there, though they're not wealthy, in the warmth and the family love. And so from our point of view on the outside, this Christmas is the first cozy meal, and we have kept it cozy ever since. And to prove to you that coziness is indeed a part of all Christmases, think of the Christmas music we hear only at Christmas that without Dickens never would have made it as a Christmas carol or a Christmas song. I mean, talk about a Christmas song. If you remember what song actually is a Christmas song, let me quote the opening lines. It goes, "Chestnuts roasting on an open fire, Jack Frost nipping at your nose." We hear that exclusively at Christmas. Now think about that song. Where's the baby Jesus? Nowhere. Where's mention of religion? Nowhere. But because Dickens did such a great job of making sure that we associate coziness and Christmas, you can get away with a song like that, and we never even give it a second thought. Another song that is only played at Christmas. I know this because I don't know what it's like up there, but in Raleigh, we have one of these Christmas radio music stations. They get kind of carried away. They play nothing but Christmas music from about July 4th through Valentine's Day. It really gets sickening, but on this, about every third hour, you hear chestnuts roasting, and the other one you hear that has nothing to do with Christmas, you will absolutely hear the song. I just want to move that a little bit away. Hope that's a little bit better picture. That goes, let it snow, let it snow, let it snow. What in the world does that have to do with Christmas? Why is it only played at Christmas? Well, now you know, because Dickens made it cozy. Listen to the opening two lines of that. Talk about the perfect definition of cozy. Though the weather outside is frightful, the fire is so delightful. That's why we have it as we do. It turns out because Dickens experienced white Christmases, he made them cozy for the first time. We've never gotten away from that. It should send a shiver down your spine that Bing Crosby's greatest hit is because Mount Tambora exploded in the South Seas in 1816, and a very sensitive little boy named Charles Dickens, who was going to grow up to be this great writer and give us the greatest expression of the Christmas spirit in the English language, was born. That's how it goes. And before we turn to Dickens specifically, since, as you heard, I am a professor at the University of North Carolina and North Carolina State at Duke. I'm not from North Carolina. I'm a Hoosier from Indiana, but I've lived here for over 45 years. I do just want to put in a plug. When they asked to draw up the best Christmas stories of all time, good heavens, Dickens is number one, and there's really no competition. But you do need to know that in the second place, after Christmas Carol, it is in number 2 place. It's a story that I'm pretty sure you all know, but it's from a North Carolina author. The story is The Gift of the Magi. It's by an author who used the pen name of O. Henry, but who is William Sidney Porter, and he's from Greensboro, North Carolina, spent more than half of his life there. So even though Dickens in England has number 1, we Tar Heels North Carolina are proud that this story was so much good to say about Dickens. So now, let me point this out. Well, I told you, and I think you're convinced, that Dickens certainly celebrated Christmas in a way in Christmas Carol that has made it different ever since. It's hard. But the point is, the only reason he changed Christmas is because everybody in the English speaking world read Christmas Carol. And I'm pretty much not exaggerating. From the moment it came out, it was a wild, wild success. So that's going to, that darn sun is moving. So I'm going to move with it. There we go. Looking at me is nothing. So actually the sun could come in, he wouldn't even be bothered, but I think that's better. Anyway, what I want to tell you now is that it turns out that it wouldn't have influenced Christmas at all if nobody read it, but everybody read it. And so that brings up the question, why did everybody read Christmas Carol when they didn't have a clue what it was going to be about? Is it because it was the pinnacle of Dickens's career? It was the last thing or one of the last things he wrote, so everybody knew how good he was? Nope. I told you he wrote it in 1843. I also mentioned he was born in 1812. So Dickens was all of 31 and a half when he conceived Christmas Carol. That's all. He had just basically turned 30. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think of 30, from my perspective, it seems like late adolescence. I mean, 30 is young. So why would this young author have the world come to read Christmas Carol when there wasn't much publicity back then? Here's why. He might have only been a little over 30, but Dickens had been an international superstar as a writer from the time he was 25. Even though he was just a little over 30 when he wrote Christmas Carol, listen to what he actually had written before, and they were all international bestsellers. When he was 25, he wrote Pickwick Papers. When he was 26, he wrote Oliver Twist. When he was 27, he wrote Nicholas Nickleby. When he was 28, he wrote The Old Curiosity Shop. When he was 30, he wrote Barnaby Rudge. And all five of those were instantaneously huge hits. So my point is, the reason he changed Christmas is because he was so incredibly famous before he wrote it that they would have read anything he wrote. And that's why Christmas has changed, because everybody saw it. So what I want to show you now is how in the world he could be so famous, and the most famous young author of all time in English, that early, that made Christmas Carol so famous. Here is why. Now, I told you that when Dickens was 25 years old, he'd have his first bestseller. And you may remember I said it was Pickwick Papers. What he did was, when he was 25 and he was an unknown, he basically walked into a publisher and said, I'm Charles Dickens. I've written my first novel. I'd like you to publish it. And of course, the publisher said, nobody's ever heard of you, Dickens. You're so young, we'd lose a fortune. Forget it. And Dickens, who was not shy, said, you must have misheard me. I'm Charles Dickens. I've written my first novel. I want you to publish it. And I want you to charge $200 a copy for my novel. Now, Dickens didn't say $200, he used pounds, but translating into today's money, Dickens was saying that he wanted them to charge $200 for this novel. Well, of course, the publisher looked at him and said, are you crazy, Dickens? Sir Walter Scott, who was the greatest writer at that time, we can't even get $20 for his novel. Nobody's gonna pay you $200 for a novel. Dickens said, not only can I guarantee that everybody's gonna pay $200, but better yet, once they've paid it, they won't know they've spent the money. And the publisher said, we're gonna charge $200 for your novel. Everybody's gonna buy it for $200, and then they won't know they paid the money? Impossible. No, said Dickens, because we're not going to bring out this novel like a novel. Publisher said, how can you bring out a novel not like a novel? Dickens said, simple. I want you to bring out my novel once a month, 3 chapters at a time. And the publisher said, what? Dickens said, look, make people come to the bookstore in January. They will pay us a shilling, which wasn't much money even back then. And you know what they're going to get for their shilling? They're going to get chapter 1, 2, and 3 of my novel. But Dickens said, you know what? They'll have to come back in February, won't they? And pay another shilling so they can get chapter 4, 5, and 6. But Dickens said, you know what? They're going to then have to come back in March and pay another shilling, and they'll get chapters 7, 8, and 9. And Dickens said, and I quote, I'm going to make this novel so god awful long they'll be buying it for 2 years. We will finally get all their money. They will finally get all my novel. The publisher looked at Dickens and said, Dickens, that will never work. Dickens said, why not? Because, the publisher said, you write books, Dickens, but I publish them. So you don't know that it cost me a minimum of 3 shillings a copy to produce any book. Even this once a month, 3 chapter at a time thing you've dreamed up as your novel, it's going to cost me 3 shillings a copy to print it. You just told me to sell it for 1 shilling. We will certainly know when we sell your novels because we will lose 2 shillings a copy. Dickens said, no. Dickens said, I've done my homework. There is a way that we can make a fat profit on 1 shilling a copy. What Dickens did, he brought with him a book. It could have been any book. He holds up the book, looks at the publisher and says, now, isn't it true when someone buys a book, it doesn't matter whether the book has 50 pages or 500 pages, people don't actually pay in the price of the book for how many pages it has. And the publisher said, that's right, Dickens, as you probably know, pages are made out of cheap paper pulp. They cost us almost nothing. So yes, it's true. They're not paying for how many pages, but so what? Dickens said, well, then, isn't it also true that it turns out they're not paying for the pages because it's cheap, but it turns out that wood is very expensive. And it turns out that the front cover and the back cover and the spine are made of wood all the time. They are expensive and they determine the price of the book. And the publisher said, well, yes, but so what? Dickens said, well, how come for my first novel, we can't invent a new kind of book that has the covers made out of the same thing as the pages, cheap paper pulp. He said you could have the front cover made out of paper pulp, the back cover will be made out of paper pulp. Dickens said, well, you know, you could call it paperback. He thought that had a nice ring to it. I am telling you that in 1836, Charles Dickens single-handedly invented the mass market paperback book. The publisher says, well, yes, Dickens, it's true. If we made it all out of paper, we could make a profit on the shilling, but we're still going to go bankrupt selling your book. Why, said Dickens? Because, the publisher said, everybody's going to come the first month in January and buy the first 3 chapters of your book. It's clever, it's gimmick, it's paperback, it's cheap. Who knows, maybe half of those people come back in February, they'll buy the next 3 chapters. I don't know, maybe half of those people are still reading the book in March. They'll come back and buy the next 3 chapters and give us another shilling. But the publisher said, don't kid yourself, Dickens. Nobody in his or her right mind is going to come back every month for 2 years to give us more shillings. He said, you know what's going to happen with this novel, Dickens? People will start reading the novel, and then people will get bored with the novel, and then people will stop reading the novel. But since we, the publishers, have to publish it once a month, 3 chapters at a time to keep getting money, nobody's going to be reading it after the first half, but we've got to keep publishing it to get to the end. We'll go bankrupt. Dickens said, I don't care if I let this novel go on for 5 years, 60 months. People will be throwing money at us more eagerly at the end than they did at the beginning, because, Dickens said, I'll just make sure that at the end of each monthly installment, at the end of chapter 3 and 6 and 9 and 12, on the last page, in the last paragraph, something incredible will happen. The publisher said, well, like what? Dickens said, how's this? At the end of chapter 3, I'll have my hero start walking up a really steep cliff, but there'll be a huge root growing out of the ground of the cliff. My hero won't see the root. He will trip over the root and fall completely off the cliff at the end of chapter 3. But, Dickens said, I'll be sure that my hero has forgotten to cut his fingernails for 2 years. They'll be really, really long. So when he falls off the cliff, he will look at his nails and get a great idea. With his last ounce of energy before he plummets, he will grasp out towards that cliff. And in the second to the last sentence of chapter 3, he'll be hanging at that cliff by his nails alone. But Dickens said, that's not all. In the last sentence of chapter 3, I'll have somebody else start walking up that same old cliff. But the readers won't know, is that somebody the hero's friend who will pick him up from the edge of the cliff and save him? Or is it the villain who will stomp on his knuckles and send that hero crashing to his death in the ocean below? And Dickens said, you know how people can find out who it is? No, said the publishers. How? Simple. Make them put down their money in February and buy chapter 4, 5, and 6. In that flash second of inspiration, when Dickens was only 24 years old, he not only invented the way that every one of his novels would come out first. Dickens never published it as a novel. He published it in serialization once a month, 3 chapters at a time. But as I need not tell you, Dickens also just happened to invent General Hospital, The Young and the Restless, all of daytime TV but the game shows. Dickens invents the soap opera in 1836. He is the first person to come up with the wonderful idea. Now, he didn't call it soap opera, of course. He had a much better name for it. Dickens called it procrastinated suspense. And that is exactly what it still is today. It's what draws us to Downton Abbey and everything else. Well, the publisher hears this idea and says, Dickens, this is genius. What are we going to call your novel? Dickens said, well, I've invented this sports club, the Pickwick Club. And the publisher says, great, we're going to call it the Pickwick Club. No, Dickens said, have you not been listening? This is the first paperback novel of all time. We need to advertise that. We're going to call it the Pickwick Papers. And they did. Was it a success? Well, turns out it is the best-selling novel of 1836. But of course, thanks to the way Dickens brought it out, it was the best-selling novel of 1837 because it was still coming out in 1837. In 1900, they did a survey. What was the best-selling novel of the entire 19th century? You guessed it, Pickwick Papers, coming out in serialization, that Dickens wrote when he was only 24. And you think you know why it was so famous and so popular, because I've just told you that in that novel, he not only invented the soap opera, but he invented the paperback and the cliffhanger as well. But amazingly, that is not why it sold so well. It wasn't what Dickens came up with as the novel came out. It's what he came out with after it came out that made him and the publisher a fortune. Because you see now, if you wanted to buy his book, you had a problem. You had to go to the bookstore or the stationer's shop the first day of each month, put down your shilling, and get the 3 chapters for the paperback Pickwick. Well, the problem was, do you know what people had once they bought the whole thing? They had a pile of trash, because I'm telling you, the paper that Pickwick Papers was printed on was of such poor quality, it kind of fell apart if you read it too hard. It was cheap junk paper, but nobody cared. They were only paying a shilling. They weren't expecting much. But the problem came after they had bought Pickwick Papers. Because you see, back in 1836, and I'm here because of the public library, but I bet you don't know that the first public library was not until the 1890s. This is 1836. There were no libraries. Well, there were, but you know where the library was then? It was in your house. If you were middle or upper middle class, you had one room in your house that had mahogany bookshelves. It was dedicated to your collections of books that you bought. When you finished a book you loved, you proudly displayed it in your library for people to come and see. But you see, now people had a problem they never had before. Now, with Pickwick, they had a pile of junk. They tried to put the Pickwick Papers paperback up against in their library, maybe a leather-bound Ivanhoe or Pride and Prejudice. Well, it looked terrible. The whole room looked awful. What were they to do? Well, Charles Dickens and his publishers, with their big hearts, came to the rescue. Because in September of 1837, when the last 3 chapters of Pickwick finally came off the presses, everybody runs to the bookstore to buy the last installment of Pickwick Papers, because you know how Dickens ties up everything at the end. Now you know why. Everybody wanted to know how it ended. So they bought the last installment of the paperback Pickwick. But they noticed as they were leaving that bookstore that they'd been visiting for 2 years to buy it, they noticed on the other side of the bookstore, piled high to the ceiling, were leather-bound, gilt-edged, silk ribbon markered editions of the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. Well, people picked up this leather-bound Pickwick and thought, whew, wouldn't that look great in my library? Everybody bought the hardback edition because it looked so nice for a display copy. So they took it home and there they had it. So you know what this means, don't you? Well, sure you do. It means that Dickens is the only writer who's ever lived to sell the same book to the same people twice. They couldn't wait to buy the parts to find out what happened next, but then they weren't going to put that junk in the library, so they were happy to pay the bigger price to get a nice display copy. He had them buy it twice. But we're not finished. If you ever wondered, how did Dickens come up with anything as greedy as Ebenezer Scrooge? Listen carefully. Once everybody bought the display copy, Dickens had his greatest commercial thought of all, which was, well, now that they've bought the hardback, what are they going to do with the cheap 3-chapter parts of Pickwick they bought for, 18 to 24 months? Well, he knew what they were going to do. They were going to throw them away. They didn't need it. They had the display copy. Nobody threw away the paperback. You know why? Because 3 weeks after the hardback came out, the publisher would send a salesman to your door. The salesman would say, have you bought the beautiful hardback Pickwick Papers by Dickens? And you'd say, well, yes, I'm not buying another one from you. Oh, no, the salesman was trained to say, I don't want to sell you anything. And then as an afterthought, he'd say, by the way, what were you going to do with those cheap 3-chapter parts of Pickwick you've been buying for 2 years? Oh, you'd say, I'm dumping them. I don't need them anymore. Oh, no, the salesman would say, may I buy back from you every installment of the paperback Pickwick? Now, they paid you almost nothing for the whole thing, but what did you care? You were going to dump it. You had the hardback. Now, why would Dickens and the publishers buy back every installment of the cheap paper Pickwick? I'll tell you why. They bought them all back, and then they ripped off the front and back cover of each of them. Now, of course, that gave them 3 chapters of Pickwick. They put them together in chronological order, but this time they sewed them into a gorgeous Morocco leather spine that had a thin gold carat bonding around the edges. And this was sold as the collector's edition of Pickwick Papers, printed on the original paper when this international bestseller first came out. Now, I know you're thinking, well, nobody's going to buy the collector's edition. They bought it in parts. They had the display copy. What would they need with this expensive one? And it was hideously expensive. I'll tell you what they needed it for. Anybody who could get the money together to buy the collector's edition, and it was expensive, immediately ran out to buy it. But you see, they didn't take it home. They already had the display copy in the house. You know what you did with the collector's edition? Well, you took it to your bank. You put it in your safety deposit box because you now had the original paper of the greatest selling novel of all time. You put it in your safety deposit box, and if you could wait and you bequeathed it to, let's say, your favorite child, I've seen wills that do this, that thing, that work of art, that original Pickwick went up so high in value. It was a better investment than any stock or bond today. So you were going to make a fortune, or your heirs were. It was a tremendous investment, and anybody who had the money bought it. So you realize what I have told you today, that Charles Dickens is the only writer who has ever lived or will live to sell the same book to the same people 3 times each, once in parts, once in hardback, bought back the parts, ripped off the front cover, ripped off the back cover, ripped you off by selling it right back to you at an enormous profit that you were willing to give him because Dickens had come up with this sensational idea. Now you realize I have now told you how Dickens changed everything and how we published novels when he was only 24. But you know what's so sad? The most fascinating things about Dickens happened when he was 25, 26, and 27. But gosh, my 50 minutes are up. So I guess if you wanted to know what happened to Dickens next, you'd have to have me back for a lot more money to do the second installment of Charles Dickens. Well, it has been 50 minutes. That's more than enough time. I will turn it over. If you have any questions, if you're still awake and you want to ask anything, I'll be glad to answer it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Engel, for that lecture. Really fascinating. This is our time to open it up to all our participants who may have questions. I'm going to allow folks to unmute themselves and start their videos if you wish to ask a question on the mic, or if you prefer, you can drop a question in the chat window and I can announce it to the group for a recording and for Dr. Engel to answer here. Does anyone have any questions that they would like answered today? We have one question coming from Lynn in the chat here, who asks, are there any of these collector's copies still in existence?
That's a really good question. And as far as we know, no. And the answer, well, actually, there are none that are outside of incredible libraries like Cambridge and Oxford. And the reason is, of course, I mentioned that originally Pickwick was printed on such cheap paper to make more profit. Well, all these collector's editions were at the mercy of that cheap paper. And so when it was bequeathed to their son, nobody knew to put it behind glass necessarily. So they own, and they would be worth probably, from what I heard, $50,000. But as far as we know, never has one gone up from auction like that. So if you want to see it, you can see it probably in New York City, I would think. I've got to remember the original manuscript of Christmas Carol is at the, it's a person's name, that wonderful little library. It'll come to me, but no, as far as the collector's edition, they just didn't hold up. What is that library? If I don't come up with it, I will need all their phone numbers, because when I think of it late at night, I'll call everybody and say, it's at this library. But that's the manuscript of Christmas Carol. But to me, that's far more valuable than a collector's edition of Pickwick Papers. The Berg, I got it. The Berg, B-E-R, have you heard of it? The Berg, I assume you have, Bradley. The Berg Library in New York City has the manuscript of Christmas. And it's so funny that originally it was not Bob Cratchit, it was Fred Cratchit. So you see him scratching out Fred. Somehow, we just can't think of, Bob Cratchit being Fred. Anyway, a long answer to a short question.
Beautiful. Questions coming in fast and furious now. Christopher asks, okay, what was the price of the hardcover and of the collector's edition? Gosh,
that is a very good question, which always means I forgot to write it down. The hardcover, now remember, people had already paid. I told you it was $1 a copy. Whoops. Am I still there? I've kind of disappeared. Can you all, it doesn't matter if you see me, you can hear me. Is that right, Bradley?
We can see and hear you now, just a little blip.
Yes. Good. Okay. So, for the first novel really was 18 months, not 24. So they'd already paid 18 shillings, for the part. And so they charged the same amount, 18 shillings for the beautiful hardback copy, because they figured, people are eager, but they're not that eager to put it in their library. So it was just double. It was the same price for one book as it was for the 18 parts that they bought, 18 shillings. And I forget how many pounds that is. I can't remember in 1836 the pounds and the shilling. And I was only told once in a graduate seminar what the collector's edition was. I think it's because, we're all academics and it was so expensive. Nobody's interested because we're all poor and we didn't really want to know how much people had to pay for Charles Dickens that we could never afford.
I have a question, if you could hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you, Vincent.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
I can hear you fine.
Thank you. I just read a book on Dickens, where it also mentioned that for his novels, he used to make tours in the United States, maybe elsewhere too, to do readings of his novels. Is that?
Yes, let me answer. It is true. And the one that you can imagine, he did more than one. His favorite was The Death of Nancy and Oliver Twist. He didn't just do readings. I mean, he did dramatic interpretations. But the one everybody wanted to hear was A Christmas Carol. And I mean, he didn't make it to Poughkeepsie, but New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and his Christmas Carol, the whole thing. He shortened it, and we have that. So if you have Christmas Carol short, but if you really want a great version, you want his desk version, and you can buy that. You can go online, where he even shortened it further, but it's magnificent. It's about only 2/3 the length of Christmas Carol, but you wouldn't know what he left out because he was so good at cutting it since he wrote it. But my point is, he came to America in 1868 and did 6 months of readings, and he took home $0.4 million in our money. So I'm so glad you brought it up. He not only was an entrepreneur in publishing his works, but then he went on the road and he did it. And I will tell you this one anecdote, which I think is so funny, and it took place in New York City, which isn't that far away. He came in the winter to do his readings, and it was in December about this time, and there was a blizzard in Manhattan, and he was performing in Manhattan, and I mean, it was just snowing up and icing. And so 2 people were trying to get back to their home, 2 Manhattanites, and they came upon people all dressed up, and they were headed towards the auditorium. I forget which one that Dickens was performing in Manhattan. And the man looked at the family that was going to see Dickens, and he said, "You're still going to hear Charles Dickens? I wouldn't go out on a night like this to see St. Paul." And the father of the family replied, "Oh, neither would we. But this is Charles Dickens." So that tells you what kind of popularity he had. Thank you for asking that.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay.
Is
Is that it?
Go
Go
just
right
a quick
ahead.
question. Did he have family? Did Dickens have a family?
Being Jewish, I have to say, oi, I wish you wouldn't have asked. It turns out Dickens not only had a family, he had a wife and 10 kids. And
Wow.
when he dumped his wife after 17 years of marriage and took off with a second-rate actress, the reason that Dickens gave for leaving Mrs. Dickens, he said, "Her figure has gone to seed, and here I am, this famous, international star." So Dickens had a great love for people in his works, but he really, really was a pig as a husband. And he took 9 of those 10 children away from Mrs. Dickens. They couldn't even live with her. So he had a lot to answer for. And poor Mrs. Dickens had a rather miserable last 10 years of her life, and she actually died of cancer, but she outlived Dickens. So we're glad to hear that.
Yay.
So yes, she had.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Seeing
Is that it?
one last question in the chat after
Okay.
many people asking, as you already answered about
I have,
the
I have,
hardcover and collector's edition. Vincent, do you have another question?
yes. Also in the novel I read, it mentioned about a train crash that he was involved in, and it was quite horrific in the States, and that he actually was like a hero in that. Even
Well, let me answer that. I'm sure he's a heroic man. It was in 1865, and his last completed novel, called Our Mutual Friend, he had the manuscript. He had finished it. He writes them all out ahead of time, you know. He had finished the manuscript, and he was carrying it with him when he was traveling on the train. And guess who was with him? His mistress, Ellen Ternan. And yes, the train crashed, and it was terrible. Some people were dying. Dickens was thrown free, but Dickens immediately climbed back in that train. And there were people who were very injured there, and he helped them and gave them water, and he couldn't have been nicer. But let's be honest, the reason he climbed back into that train, the manuscript of Our Mutual Friend was in the train, so he had to go retrieve it. But he was a decent enough sort that, you know, once he had it, he was very happy to help other people. I kind of hate to, you know, I hate to spoiler alert, but yes, he did help some people, but he needed that manuscript, and he sure didn't want to be seen with his mistress.
Thank you.
Oh, I have a question. May I ask a question?
Yes.
My question is, well, Dr. Engel, would you consider coming back for a third time? Well, I'm so glad you asked. I have 51 different topics: Dickens, Poe, Shakespeare, Twain, Wizard of Oz. Anyway, so you've been a great audience both times, even though I couldn't see you. So do consider, if you'd like me back, you know, I'm not shy. I'd come back in a heartbeat. Again, thank you very much.